containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.
And it helps me a ton because like this series, especially on the Dead Sea Scrolls that I'm trying to build, is a massive undertaking. Um, and people should be watching it. And if you haven't yet, please watch from the start. But what I'm attempting to do, which is completely new and completely different, is to tell the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls in exceptional detail, but not just the story of the texts and their contents, but also the history of their discovery and how the discovery and what was happening in the world around the time of this discovery really shaped the way in which scholarly conversations about the scrolls have proceeded over the course of the last 70 years. So it's and it's all of course built within the title. It's Dead Sea Scrolls unapologetically. The other thing I'm trying to do is to set the record straight about a lot of the apologetic claims that Christians tend to make about the scrolls, which quite frankly are just not, they're just not right. They're not correct. They're misleading. So let's learn about the scrolls.
Let's
Okay. At this point, I have a few comments and a few questions, especially about the Christian apologetics that Dr. Kip is referring to. Okay, so this series, is a pretty interesting series. I would recommend people to go and watch this video, and also to go to Dr. Kip's website. I mean, not his website, but his YouTube channel where he has the videos about the Dead Sea Scroll, and go ahead and watch them there as well because there's some pretty interesting information. Okay, and I find it fascinating myself, and so I am I've been watching. I went to the site to his YouTube channel and I've watched some of his videos, and they're pretty interesting. So I would recommend people to go and take a look at it. Okay. Now, in reference to what he's talking about here, in terms of the history of the scrolls and how they were researched, the Dead Sea Scrolls, that is, and about the Christian apologetics, what they're saying. I mean, he didn't specify what they're saying about it, but I guess we're gonna get into that as we go along. But my concern here also is not just the Christian apologetics, or the Christian apologists, but what about what about the Jewish apologists? That would be the most pertinent thing here, I would think. And so I would be interested to know what he's gonna say about the Jewish apologists, and I haven't seen anything so far mentioned about Jewish apologists. Okay, there's reference to Christian apologists, but not Jewish apologists, because I mean this is the most important thing when it comes to these scrolls. Is what uh, the Jewish apologists say about the scrolls, right? Because as you know, there are Christian apologists and Jewish apologists. Okay, so from what I know about these scrolls, and I've been, like I said, I've been looking at Dr. Kip's channel to get some background on it, and some other research I've done on my own. And the first thing that was the first thing about the scrolls was that, first of all, when they were first discovered, they were not accessible to scholars immediately. Okay, that's the first red flag about these scrolls. Okay, they were kept inaccessible to scholars for decades before they were released to the general scholarship to examine. Right? That's number one. Okay. I haven't seen much about that from Dr. Kip. Maybe I missed it, but I haven't actually watched all his videos yet. So I'm gonna finish watching them. But from what I've seen so far, I haven't seen anything about that. But anyway, uh, I mean, and also there's a lot of uh, let's say fake Dead Sea Scrolls going around now. Dr. Kip on his YouTube channel did cover that extensively. Okay, because he was also involved in verifying some of these scrolls. So he's intimately aware of the fact that there's been, fraud, Dead Sea Scroll fraud from the very beginning, and he goes into that on his YouTube channel. So again, I recommend that you go to his YouTube channel and watch these videos on the Dead Sea Scroll. They're very interesting, and he's done a great job in documenting, from the very beginning, as he says here. I have to give him kudos for that. Great job. He's he's done a lot of documentation. Now, the conclusion that are drawn from this is, we might have to agree to disagree on what these conclusions are, but there's no disputing that he has done a lot of work on documentation. Okay, so again, I recommend go and watch this video on his go and watch his videos on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Very interesting stuff if you want to learn anything about this topic. Okay, so with that being said, immediately after these scrolls were found, as I just stated, they were not made available to the public. They kept in secret for decades before they were released, which is very suspicious as to why that was. You know, very, and even today, uh, much of the work done at these digs that they were these excavations that was done by the person, the Vo, which he references, uh, have not been released even to this day. Okay, this is very important. A lot of the stuff that DeVoe, which is one of the main authorities on these scrolls, the person that went there and did all this excavation, uh, he died before his findings were. I mean, some of them have been released, but from what I know, most of the stuff that he did on these scrolls, in terms of the excavations, have not been released. Okay, that's number two. So there's a lot more to be known about that. So to me, it seemed a bit suspicious that the scroll was kept incommunicado for so long, for decades, literally decades. And even to this day, in terms of the testing of these scrolls, a lot of forgeries have been found, as Dr. Kip references, in private collections, but they have been tested and found to be fakes. Okay, but Dr. Kip is going to also reference what I'm going to say now, is that a lot of the scroll that's in Israel, that in the authority that handles that, they haven't been tested to see if they're fake or not. They've just been assumed to be authentic. Okay, based on I guess paleography. But again, Dr. Kip is going to tell you about paleography. That's the most, that's one of the ways that they figure out how old these scripts are. Uh, but the problem with paleography is that it's mostly subjective. Okay, it's not an objective way to look at these scripts. I would think these fragments. It judges by handwriting style, this, that, and the other, and quiet as kept, a lot of these scrolls had to be redated because they were first dated using paleography, and then later on they did additional testing using using archaeology, and what they found out was that the paleography was a little like in terms of the paleography, to determine how old they were, they went a little bit overboard with the paleography. So they had to revise the dates on a lot of these fragments to much later than that one. That was first thought of using paleography. Okay, so this is the next thing. But uh, so the thing about these scrolls again is that immediately they were assumed, and this goes back to my point about Christian apologetics as opposed to Jewish apologetics. A lot of these scrolls were immediately assumed to be Jewish scrolls. That's number one. Okay, and that they were assumed to be written by some Hessian community, which most of the evidence for the Hessian community hypothesis comes from Josephus. Okay, which is not a reliable person. I mean, Josephus is mostly a propagandist, and there's even I mean, I'm not even sure if Josephus was actually a real person. He could, I mean, it's possible he was, but I tend to doubt it. So that's where most of the references in terms of these documents being Esseni documents or documents that was by the same community. This is where most of it come from, and you know that that hypothesis is the prevailing hypothesis, and basically it's based on not any real evidence, but it's based on assumptions because of where the documents were found. So basically, they found these documents in the desert, and then they assumed that these documents was written where they were found. And so what they did was they extrapolated a community around, the area that they found these documents to say that, oh, this is the people that wrote these documents or collected them, as Dr. Kip is saying. I haven't, I'm not sure if he's actually saying that they wrote these documents because there's no consensus on that. I would think no one actually knows who wrote these documents. Okay, and according to Dr. Kip, one of the oldest documents in the 4Q area cave called 4Q is what he says close to 200. It goes back to 250 BCE, which is the middle of the third century. Now, that's very important because there's a couple of questions that come to mind if that's the case. If the document is that old, okay, and we're going to address them, eventually. But the most important thing is that if these documents goes back to that time, they will be around the same time that the Septuagint was written in Egypt, okay? Because according to what we know so far about the Bible scholarship, supposedly the Septuagint was written in Egypt around 250 to 270 BCE, which would be during the Ptolemaic dynasty of, I believe, Philadelphia, Ptolemy I or Ptolemy II. There's not, the consensus on that is out there still. Nobody actually, I think it's either one or two. I'm not sure which one. Now, as you all know, the general contention is that the Torah was written in Egypt according to some kind of miraculous intervention, as described by the letter of Aristeas, which is pseudepigrapha. Okay, and the contention is that the Torah was translated in Egypt by these Jewish priests that came from Israel to do that. Why they didn't translate in Israel is a mystery to me. Why it come all the way to Egypt to translate? Why not just translate it in Israel and then bring it to Egypt? But whatever. So supposedly by miraculous intervention, they was able to translate the script into Greek. Supposedly, okay. Now, I mean that's interesting. So that it was done in Egypt, and this is around 300 BCE approximately, right? So now I would think based on everything that we know about Hebrew and about the Jewish people and about actual real history as opposed to biblical history, because according to the biblical history, the Torah was written in Israel, even though he doesn't really specify when it was written in Israel. And according to the Bible, supposedly when Ezra came back from Babylon, he had a full scroll that he was reading from. That's what they assume. Why he didn't have one? Why the Israelites didn't have one before that? I don't know why. And why is it that they didn't have one till after they came back from Babylon? Okay, and what happened to that Hebrew Torah, quote unquote? No one seems to know. But supposedly after they came to Egypt and translated the scroll into Greek, they supposedly lost it. It's been lost, which is strange. Okay, how? I mean, so the Egyptians kept the scroll, but the people that produced it, the Torah actually lost it. And if they did lose it, why not just write another one? So that would be my question, as far as that's concerned. So it just makes me think that the scroll wasn't translated in Egypt. All of the evidence that we have at this point points to the fact that the scrolls were actually written in Egypt. Okay, this is what the evidence is showing because they don't have a scroll in Hebrew. So the evidence is the evidence that we actually have, the physical, actual evidence, not speculation, not guesses, but actual physical evidence that we have is that the the first uh, Torah or Septuagint, whatever you want to call it, was written in Greek. Okay. Now, another question I would have is that you know, would the Jews have translated their holy book into Greek, a language according to the rabbinic philosophy that they weren't really too fond of? Okay, why would they translate their documents into Greek? And not only that, supposedly when they were before they actually came to these Jewish priests actually came to Egypt to translate the document, they were Egyptian, they were Hebrew slaves being held by the Ptolemy in Egypt at the time, supposedly, allegedly. Which I don't believe any of that because, uh, as far as I know, there is no Egyptian word for slave. So I am not sure how they could be slaves in Egypt if they don't. Egyptians don't have a word for slave, but that's another topic that we could go into at another time. So supposedly they had slaves in Egypt. Okay, and this seems to be a typical explanation for Hebrew like for placing Hebrew Jewish people in certain areas. Like for example, they got how did they get to Babylon? They was taken there by as slaves, supposedly, allegedly. Okay, which I mean, there's not much evidence for that, but that's another story again. Uh, so now we find them in Egypt in 300 and in approximately 270 something BCE. They're in Egypt and they're there as slaves again. That's how they got there. That's the explanation for them being there, that they were slaves, which is again typical and type of and kind of strange, to So anyway, uh, this is what we have. Okay, supposedly these Jews from Palestine or Israel, whatever you want to call it, came to Egypt and they translated the scrolls into Greek so that that the Pharaoh or the Ptolemy would have this for his collection and also for the so-called Hebrews in Egypt that didn't speak uh, Hebrew. I would suppose they spoke Greek because they've been Hellenized, supposedly, quote unquote. So this is where we are in terms of how the the, uh, the Hebrew Torah was translated into Greek. That's the story. Okay. So again, as far as I can see, the evidence points to the fact that it wasn't translated in Egypt. It was written in Egypt. Okay, and more than likely, it was probably written by Egyptians. And you say, well, why would I say something like that? Well, it's simple. I mean, it's not rocket science. The Egyptians could write in Hebrew they could write in Greek, and they could write in Egyptian. The Egyptians had the most elite scribes in the history of antiquity. Okay, they were the preeminent writers of antiquity. That's the ancient Egyptians. This, they had scribal schools with, that went back thousands of years. Okay, so they had a infrastructure for writing. Okay, there was an infrastructure in place for writing in Egypt that goes back thousands of years. No such thing existed in Israel. So how Israel could have produced the Torah is a mystery to me. Okay, based on the fact that they had no infrastructure, that tradition of writing that goes back that far. Uh, you know, uh, no. When you look at the the actual history of the area where Israel is located, I'm not talking about biblical history now. I'm talking about actual history, real history, secular history. Okay, there's no such infrastructure in place. I saw a statistic about Israel and of the first century, so quote unquote, in Jesus' time, uh, and the estimate was that 3% of the population was literate, if and that was being very generous. Okay, so this is what we're talking about when we talk about Israel. Okay, in Egypt, again, I like to point out that the Egyptians were the most literate nation in antiquity. And not just the scribes, it wasn't just a scribal society that knew how to write, and the rest of the population was illiterate. That wasn't the case in Egypt. The general population of Egypt was literate. They had writings everywhere, on the walls, the temples, everywhere you look, there's writings in Egypt. Okay, they were always writing for thousands of years, which we cannot say for the rest of these nations. But that's my little piece there. So we're going to continue and hear what Dr. Keep have to say. So let's go ahead and continue.
Let's learn about the scrolls. You have something important that I think is necessary to repeat if you haven't done it on air yet, as we're leading up to the oldest Bible or oldest scroll known. And that is when you came and visited me and we recorded the 18 lecture course, which when this gets done, trust me, you'll know, we'll be screaming it from the rooftops and getting people to sign up for that course. A lot of hard work put into that, and you put so much energy and time into it. But you mentioned how your teacher was saying that the Dead Sea Scroll scholar is in the best position of being able to discuss Old Testament studies because it is the oldest material evidence for scripture, as we call it, known. So there is no, I mean, maybe you might find some fragment or something from maybe an inscription or something that might relate or be something we find that I guess you could say fits something that is biblical in its teaching, kind of like the Mount Ebal curse tablet, right? Wherever you date it, whenever you date it, this is authentic. Okay. It has curses on it. And like we know, the biblical narrative talks about curses, and this mountain may have carried a tradition where people went to this area to curse people. Okay. That doesn't mean that's scripture or that was canonical or anything like that. But this might have been a practice that found its way within the text that we call the Bible. So the earliest material data is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Can you tell us why that's so significant?
So, well, first of all, I wanted to riff a little bit on what you said at the start of your little bit there. My doctor father, George J. Brooke at the University of Manchester, used to complain about this quite a bit. He told me that when he taught Introduction to the Old Testament, he always started with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the reason he started there, and the reason why I think it's an excellent place to begin, is because this is our earliest material evidence for anything even resembling a Bible.
Okay, let's examine that claim. the Septuagint is actually the oldest document that we have that's anything close to a Bible, and it's not it's actually a Bible. Okay, it's an actual Bible, not fragments. Okay, the Dead Sea Scroll are fragments. Okay, and the jury is actually still out on this Dead Sea Scroll scholarship. There is no guarantee that they're even genuine. First of all, okay, again, like I said previously, there's been a lot of fraud and fake Dead Sea Scrolls discovered, and Dr. Kipp has discovered some of them himself. Okay, the ones that I don't know if 4Q has been tested and carbon dated and and done and tested archaeologically, not tested archaeologically, but using archaeology to determine the date in addition to just paleography. But as I stated before, a lot of these scrolls at the Qumran was previously dated using paleography, and then they had to be redated to a later date using archaeology. In other words, they weren't as old as the paleographers were estimating. Again, because paleography is subjective, okay, and it's very difficult to determine. And people can, there's a lot of fakes going around. So this is the situation. So to claim that these documents are the oldest, I mean, there's no guarantee of that. We don't actually know that yet because many of these documents haven't been tested to determine whether they're even fake or real, as others were that were in private collections. I'm talking about the ones that's in the hands of the Israeli authorities. We don't, or Palestinian authorities, whoever has them. We don't know. A lot of them haven't been tested to have been subjected to the same rigorous testing as the ones that's been in private collections. So we don't even know if these in the hands of the Israeli or Palestinian authorities are actually genuine, if they're actually as old as they're claiming them to be. So there still could be copies of the Septuagint. Okay, and this is it's a distinct possibility. But let's continue.
It's no short of a consternation for myself, for other scholars of early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular. Just I've applied for positions in Old Testament departments at universities, and this is a common thing. Like when people like me who've spent their lives studying the scrolls will apply for positions in Old Testament departments at universities, it's not uncommon to get a response from the search committees going, "Well, you're not really an Old Testament scholar," which drives me crazy because if you're a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, of course you are deeply invested in what the Old Testament is about, where it came from, and what's going on in there. And what I continue to tell people is that, again, this should be the starting point, and that's kind of what we're doing here today. Instead of speaking of the first Bible, the origins of the Bible, from where we think it should have began. Well, book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible. It starts with the story of Adam and Eve, or if you're a slightly more critical thinker than that, they started putting together traditions of the Torah all the way back in the First Temple period, during the reigns of David and Solomon or Hezekiah or who have you. Maybe did they?
Right.
We tend to think, yeah, probably, but this is something that Christian apologists will continue to remind us of, is that you can't prove any of that, and they're absolutely right. So what do we have? We've got manuscripts, and the manuscripts we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls are predominantly from the 1st century BCE. and we've got a bunch from the 1st century CE. So it's like from 100 BC to probably 67 CE, which is when we tend to think that the community was driven out by the Romans and the site was destroyed. But we also have stuff there that's a fair bit older than that. We have manuscripts, quite a bunch from the 2nd century BCE, and we even have a handful, one of which we're going to show today, way back from the mid 3rd century BCE. So we have a small handful of copies of texts from the time when some people probably actually could remember Alexander the Great. It was in the middle, text from right in the middle of when Hellenism was becoming deeply integrated into the cultural religious expressions of the people who collected this literature. We have texts that come from a time prior to the establishment of the independent kingdom of the Hasmoneans in 180 BCE. So we've got a handful of these manuscripts which are very, very old. So I don't know. Do you want to show it now?
Yeah, I think I do. I want to tease people. Just saying, get ready. We're going to show you the oldest, at least according to the consensus of Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay, I just before we get to that, the oldest document that he's going to show us, I also want to make another point about what Dr. Kip just said, and he's talking about the Hasmoneans. The Maccabees, the book of the Maccabees, right? Hasmonean dynasty. To me it's a bit strange that here he's saying that they have these writings come from before the Hasmonean dynasty, right? Now, uh, which is around 180 to 160 BC, from what I know, when that was established, supposedly. Uh, what was before that, we don't really know, because then we are in the area of legends, okay, in terms of Jewish history, okay. So if we want to be on solid ground in terms of Hebrew history, we'd have to actually start with the Hasmonean dynasty, as far as I can see. Uh, Now, the funny thing about that is that the Hasmonean dynasty, or the book of the Maccabees, is not a part of the Jewish canon, even though Hanukkah is a holiday a Jewish holiday that is celebrated, and that has something to do with the Hasmonean dynasty and the rededication of the temple, right? Now, you know, supposedly it was, that this Hanukkah is due to the victory of the Maccabees, or Judas Maccabeus, over the Antiochus, I believe, King Antiochus, or whatever, how do we pronounce it? And that, basically the Jews established themselves semi-independently during that time, and Hanukkah had something to do with that. But the way the Hanukkah is celebrated is something about the oil in the lamp lasting 8 days, when there was only enough oil for 11 days. I mean, for one day. Okay, and then so the emphasis is on that aspect of the Hanukkah, as opposed to the Maccabean aspect. Yeah, okay, so which is a little bit strange to me, that the Maccabees is not in the Jewish canon, but it's in the Christian canon. In some, not all of them, but some of them. In some of them, it's called Apocrypha. But but in the Eastern Orthodox Church and in the Ethiopian, they have the Maccabees, but the Hebrews don't. The Hebrew Bible doesn't. The Masoretic Hebrew Bible doesn't have it. Okay, it's in the Septuagint as well. So it's been taken out of the Masoretic Bible, because again, the Masoretic Bible supposedly is the Hebrew Bible, but the oldest Masoretic Bible that we have is from the 9th century or 10th century. So there is no manuscript, Masoretic manuscript that's older than that. Okay, so that had to be a copy of the Septuagint, a redactation of the Septuagint, because they cannot produce an original manuscript that the Masoretic text was copied from. An original Hebrew, an original text written in Hebrew. They can't find that. The Jews claim that they lost it. Okay, so the Masoretic text, as far as I can see, had to be copied from the Septuagint, or a version of the Septuagint. Okay, this is where the evidence points to at this point. Anything else is just speculation. Okay, we have to, if we're going to go by evidence, we can go by speculation if we want to, but let's just go by the evidence. And the evidence is that there is no Hebrew script. There is no script written in Hebrew, and currently the only thing that we have is a Septuagint. And then now they're coming up with this. They found these fragments of in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they're trying to say that it's a possibility that, well, they're not. The Jewish apologists are not saying it's a possibility. They're basically trying to say that these are Jewish writings and that they're older than the Septuagint. And this is what Dr. Kipp is saying here, the oldest Bible in the world, which is kind of misleading. Really. So there is no guarantee that this is the case, and again, the jury is still out on that. Okay, and these are just scraps. There's no complete Bible or anything like that. And as a matter of fact, a lot of these documents that they're claiming to be Jewish documents, okay, and again, the jury is out on that as well. If they're actually Jewish documents written by Jews. Because again, there's no infrastructure for producing those type of documents in the area that they claim that they found them. Just because you found them in an area, that doesn't mean that was written in that area. But this is what they're trying to establish, that they were written where they were found. And if that's the case, if some of these documents are 250 it goes back to 250 BCE. So you're saying to me that the Torah was written by Jews around 250 BC. Okay, fine. My question would be, where is the infrastructure for that writing? I mean, when we look at the Torah and the Old Testament and it's very well written. And Dr. Kipp himself is going to point out to you in this video that it was exquisite writing. Okay, and that it was a scribal school involved. And not only was there a scribal school involved in the writing, when they examined all of these documents in the common community, if all of these documents that they found was to have been written there, according to these scholars themselves, it would have been 700 different scribes that would have been involved in writing all these documents. 700. If the documents are assumed to have been written where they were found, and even if they weren't written where they were found, when you take the total documents together and you look at the different writing styles and this and that, then they're saying that it's over 700 scribes that was involved in the writing of these documents. My question is, where in Israel is a school of scribes that would have been 700 scribes? Where would that be, and when would that be? Okay, so it's one thing to establish that these things was written by Jews, but then we have to explain how they was written by Jews, especially if we're talking about 700 different scribes and there's no infrastructure for writing. There was no school of scribes in Israel at that point in time that we know of. There's no archaeological evidence for any of that. Okay, not even any real literary evidence for any of that. So as far as I'm concerned, the jury is still out about who actually wrote these documents. Okay, just as how the jury is out about who actually wrote the Septuagint. Okay, because we don't have any firm, a supposedly there. I mean, the assumption, and that's all it is the assumption is that it was translated from a Jewish, a Hebrew, a Torah written in Hebrew, but we don't have that Jewish Torah that we written in Hebrew. We don't have it. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist except for the Masoretics, and that's, like I said, the 9th century. So where was the original Torah written? And then when we look at the original Torah, we see that like I said, it's well written, and we see that they're talking about Yahwist and Jahwist P and all these different schools of thought as to different parts of it being written at different times. Okay, so where were the infrastructure for these different schools of thought and writing the Torah? Where in Israel can we find any of this? One thing I'm certain for sure is we can find it in Egypt. Okay, all of we have scribal schools going all the way back to 320 BC in Egypt, and further back than that. So again, Egypt was the preeminent writers of the ancient world. Okay, and I'm going to add something else to this. There's also a document called the Damascus document. Okay, and this Damascus document was found. They call it the Qumran document before Qumran. It used to be called the Zadokite fragment. Okay, they renamed it the Damascus document due to the fact that they found some similarities between it and the Qumran scroll, particularly I think 4Q. So, but this was found in Cairo, in Egypt, the Damascus document, about 100 years before the discovery at Qumran. Okay, so they found a Qumran-like document 100 years before they discovered these other documents at the Qumran site. According to the testing done on that Damascus document, they estimate that it's probably around 100 BCE or somewhere around there it was written, supposedly. Okay, what they're saying now, that they found the Dead Sea Scrolls is that, the Qumran, the Damascus document is a copy of the Qumran documents. Really? I mean, I would think it would be more likely or more logical to assume that the Damascus document is older than the Qumran documents. And why would that be? Well, I mean, again, they found it in Egypt. More than likely, it was written there in Egypt. Okay, and we know that Egypt has the infrastructure to write a document of that complexity. Okay, the Torah, Septuagint was written in Egypt, as we well know. So it's not a stretch to say that the Damascus document would be written in Egypt, where it was found, as opposed to being written. I mean, where it was found and where there's an infrastructure and scribal schools and all of that for it to be written there. Okay, so it's not a stretch to say it could have been written in Egypt because they have the infrastructure for that, as opposed to the Qumran community in the desert where there is no infrastructure, no scribal schools, none of that for these documents that they found. I mean, they could have easily been transported from Egypt to that area to be hidden there, and they could have been again written in Egypt, and they were being collected and being stored in the Qumran community. I mean, that would be the more likely scenario, and that would make much more sense because, again, the infrastructure for the writing of these documents can be found in Egypt, but not in the Qumran community. 700 scribes, that's a lot of scribes, and there's no history of scribal activity of that scale in Qumran, or anywhere in Israel for that matter. So, that would be my point. But let's continue.
Scholars that have evaluated this, the oldest papyri known.
It's not papyrus.
Oh, it isn't? What is it? Animal skin?
Yep.
Oh, okay, parchment.
There's not a lot. So, okay, and while you bring that up, I'll say something else about this. So most of the scrolls are actually parchment.
Okay.
Animal skin. There are papyrus. There are papyri in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and one of the interesting ongoing questions that scholars are continuing to investigate is the relationship between, like, why write on parchment, why write on papyrus. We now know, and this is, within the last 20 years, we now know that unlike uh, earlier ideas about papyrus, it didn't all come out of Egypt. There are places in the deep south of Palestine where, it looks like Jews were actually growing and cultivating their own papyrus.
Around the Dead Sea?
Not farther south than that.
Oh,
So,
wow. Okay.
yeah.
Okay, that's another flag. So, according to Dr. Kip, you had Jews growing and cultivating papyrus somewhere around the Dead Sea Scroll. I'm supposing that he's saying that to lay the groundwork for the assumption that whether these documents were written in parchment or in papyrus, they were written by the common community. People are Jews, as he claimed, that was growing these papyrus, so, which is again a stretch. Uh, but my question would be, where was this happening that these Jews were growing this papyrus, and when was it happening? I would need to know that. So if Dr. Kip would answer that question, that would be greatly appreciated. But let's continue.
So it's pretty interesting, and like here we'll get into this, but like one of the wrinkles that papyrus has added to this whole conversation is that, I mean, the as far as we can tell, the general rule here is that it's a cheaper, more accessible material.
Mhm.
So it's, you write on papyrus something that you want, but doesn't necessarily need to have the kind of endurance and longevity that would be required of something like an animal skin, right? So automatically, the expectation is, well, the most important stuff you're going to put on parchments, on animal skins, and stuff that is less important, so-called individual copies, like personal copies of text, as opposed to stuff that's maybe used by the community, you might put on papyrus. But we've got copies of biblical texts on papyrus, as
And so both are there.
yeah,
What we're looking at, as you say, animal skin, parchment. And so
yeah,
let's just go ahead and show them,
bring it
because
up.
we're gonna zoom in real close. This is gonna be cool. I hope
Yeah.
everybody hits the like button, drops comments in the chat. When this is over, leave a comment, all that cool stuff. Make sure you check out all their channels. And let's go ahead and take a peek here at the oldest one. And that is, what is this?
So, pull it up. There we go. Zoom in a little bit. So this is one of, I believe it's 3 or 4 fragments of 4Q17. This is a copy of text from Exodus chapter 38, 39, 40. And it looks like Leviticus chapter 1 and possibly even a little bit of chapter 2. Now this is a very interesting set of fragments from a very interesting scroll for a few reasons. In the first place, the script that has been used to pen this indicates to scholars that this is a very, very old manuscript. So people don't know the predominant method for dating manuscripts is by way of the handwriting through a system called paleography. So, on the basis of the handwriting, this manuscript has been dated to, uh, roughly about 250 BCE. Based on what remains, we are confident that this is actually a very large manuscript. On the basis of the science, the mechanics of how scrolls were stored and then deteriorated, as a general rule of thumb, where you have large fragments, and this would constitute a large fragment. This particular one measures about I think it's 14 centimeters across. Where you have large fragments, they survive from a bulk, a considerable amount of material, which suggests this was a large scroll. And of course, because of the contents, you've got a transition here from the end of the book of Exodus and the beginning of the book of Leviticus. I think scholars tend to be agreed that this most likely was a scroll that contained all of something, well, all of the book of Exodus, or something very closely resembling our copy of the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, which would have made it a very, very large document. The scholars who did the work on this, Frank Moorcross, and I don't remember the other guy, they concluded, they calculated that this manuscript at one time had 60 lines roughly in a column. And if you've seen the videos in my any of the first 3 videos in my series on the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll understand right at the outset what this means. This is a big manuscript, and it's unusually large because in the period, people tended not to construct manuscripts of this size. They tended to be shorter, and yeah, shorter and less fat, I guess, for lack of a better word. So 60 lines in a column is substantial. What we have here, and if you go towards the bottom here, Derek, I'll show you something significant that we have here is actually preservation of the bottom margin of this manuscript, which measures about 2 centimeters. And that is also an indicator to scholars that this was a sizable manuscript, because as a convention in this period, you constructed your manuscripts, and the margins you supplied to them were relative. Smaller margins for smaller manuscripts, larger margins for larger manuscripts. The 2 centimeter margin is substantial. So this was a very large, very significant copy of Exodus and Leviticus. Something like this would have been extremely expensive to produce. These are the sorts of things that tended not to be produced and owned by individuals, but rather by communities, and used in probably some sort of synagogue setting.
Anachronism alert. Anachronism alert. Okay, so let's talk about what Dr. Kip just said. So, the first thing is that he's making a point to say that this document is unusually large, and that during that time period, and we're talking about 250 BC or around there somewhere, during that time period, he claims, you tend not to write the documents that big. They tend to be a lot smaller. So that's unusual. So, and he's stating that fact. Okay. Another unusual thing about this document is that it's a copy of Exodus, supposedly, and Leviticus, which is, and it's very large to include both Exodus, as if whoever created it was trying to make sure they had both Exodus and Leviticus on there. Okay, now, which Dr. Kip himself says is unusual. Now, it's funny that it would be Exodus and Leviticus, because that's the 2 main points of the Hebrew document, which is the the history and the priesthood, right? Exodus is supposedly the history, and Leviticus is the priesthood, right? The origins of both, right? So this is what they're trying to bring across. What's again, this it's unusual, as Dr. Kip said. So we just leave it at that. Now, the other point he made was that this type of document would be very expensive to write. I mean, to produce. Okay, very expensive. And again, who in like to produce such a document in 250 BCE? Because they're assuming this is a Jewish writing, right? So where is this kind of document being written in Palestine in 250 BCE? Okay, I mean, where is the school to produce such a document? And also, Dr. Kip is saying that, this kind of document would have been produced for a personal collection as opposed to a community collection. What? I mean, what personal? Who's collecting this personally? I mean, which? I mean, so basically, the picture that I'm getting is that there were people in the 250. There was Jews 250 BCE who was writing documents and having community ownership and also personal collections. Really? I mean, as far as I know, literacy was an issue. Okay, where is the literary infrastructure or the literate infrastructure to be making to be having personal collection or private collections at that point in time in Palestine, of all places, right? So now today we talk about personal collections and community collection owned by the museum or public institutions. So my point is, where are these? I mean, it's like he's casting backward these type of institutions in Palestine in 250 BCE, and there's no evidence for any of that. Okay, none. Again, I'm going to point out, and I'm going to keep pointing out, that we can find evidence for this in Egypt, but not in Palestine. Okay, they had schools in Egypt, they had institutions, libraries, museums, the whole 9 yards, and they had personal collection. People, the society was a literate society. So in Palestine, most people couldn't read. And again, I'm going to point out at all periods, not just at that particular period, but all the way up to the 1st century. Because again, I'm going to point out there was a statistic that pointed out that only 3% of the population in Palestine was literate. So if that's the case, and that was being generous. So if that's the case, who's collecting this thing personally in Palestine? That's very strange, I would think. So, but let's continue.
So that's, I mean, in terms of the Bible, right? That's as early as that. This is the oldest Hebrew copy of Hebrew literature that we have, and making this distinction is very important. I noticed somebody mentioned in the chat, it's one of the super chats we'll get to, but the Ketif Henom amulets preserve text from the Aaronic blessing, which appears in Numbers. But these aren't. This is not a Bible, right? These were little amulets that were inscribed with text, and they were rolled up, and somebody wore them around their necks or attached to their body somewhere, probably as like magical protection devices. So this is not we should qualify that a Bible has to be a text that you can read and that you can use. It's also a substantial collection of literature. So this is the best that we've got. We've got a scroll that was large, a scroll that contained text from 2 supposed compositions, Exodus and Leviticus all together. And it's something that people used and that they read.
Real quick,
So
someone brought up the Septuagint, right? And they say the oldest Bible, and notice the term Bible keeps coming up, is the Septuagint. But let me ask you this, since we're not dealing with that term, this canonical, or we have this like grouped literature that we have defined, clearly defined. We don't know, this being honest, but we don't know what they considered their canon or Bible or whatever, if that was even a thing to them. Like, obviously they saw this as sacred literature in some way. This was important literature in some way. Nobody's denying that. The category of scripture and Bible, we have ideas of what that means. We need to strip that out of our head when we're reading or looking at this right here and saying, they have the same idea about all of this as we do. No, we don't know that, especially when they're rewriting older literature to make their own narratives about it, like Jubilees, etc. And Matthew Munger does that. So this is my question, just to make sure we're on the same page. This is Hebrew, very difficult to read. It's worn out quite a lot. But is this the oldest biblical literature, older than any Greek manuscript, older than anything?
We don't have any Greek manuscripts this old containing any quote unquote biblical text. And I think it's I need to point this out. Like, we don't know nearly as much about the Septuagint as we think we do. Like, we've got a handful of fragments. We've got traditions about how it was produced, and I tend to think there's a kernel of truth behind this.
Right.
That the Septuagint is a collection of Hebrew scriptures that came out of Alexandria at some point in the 3rd century. But what we're dealing with here, if people don't know, there are 3 primary versions of the biblical text, of the Old Testament text, that scholars will talk about. Those are the Masoretic text tradition, the Septuagint text tradition, and the Samaritan Pentateuch text tradition. So these are all textual families which have varying differences between them, which look like they were produced and then collected together in like a stream of a community. They tend to be geographically grouped. The Septuagint tradition is believed to have come out of Egyptian Jewish communities. The Samaritan tradition is believed to have stemmed from Palestine. And, the Masoretic tradition is believed to have come from the Jewish communities living in Babylon. This is all theory at this point. I think there's some there's some currency to this, but it's, again, this is still stuff that we're just kind of piecing together. So all that said, when it comes to tracing these traditions back, here's what we discover is that we kind of come to a starting point, and it's the same for all of them.
Okay. That is not necessarily the case. And the reason I would say that is Dr. Kipp is conflating, the time of these various documents that he just mentioned, the Masoretic, the Samaritan, and the Septuagint, right? What we know is that the Septuagint was first. And what we do know, it's not speculation, as he's saying something to that effect. He's not saying speculation, but he's saying, it's all we know. But the point is that the Septuagint, we know that the Septuagint is older than both the Masoretic texts, and he's going to say that, he's going to point that out himself eventually, okay? Because somebody's going to ask him a question about that. And here he's trying to make an equivalence between the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Septuagint. But the fact of the matter is that the Septuagint is the oldest of all the 3 documents that he just mentioned. Okay, again, the Septuagint goes back to 250 to 270 BCE, 3rd century BCE. The Samaritan Pentateuch, I don't think, goes back any further than the 10th century or the 9th century, around the same time as the Masoretic text. Okay, so the Pentateuch is almost what, 1,500 years older than the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch based on these calculations, right? I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I don't think so though. But if I'm wrong, somebody can correct it. But so to try to make an equivalence between the Masoretic text, the Pentateuch, and the Septuagint is not correct, because by far, from what scholars know today, the Septuagint is much older than both the Masoretic text and the Pentateuch. The Samaritan Pentateuch. This is why it's so important for Judaism that they find a Hebrew text that's older than the Septuagint, which is what they're looking for in these Dead Sea Scrolls. They're basically trying to say that the Dead Sea Scrolls is the original Hebrew scriptures that the Septuagint was copied from that. But there's no evidence for that, okay? Because there's no evidence that these documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually as old as they purport to be, okay? And even if they were as old as they purport to be, the question would still have to be who wrote them. Because as I've stated already, and it should be very clear by now, there is no infrastructure that was in Israel at any point in the history of Palestine or Israel, whichever you want to call it, to produce such a document. Which is why I would think that it was never reproduced in Israel, okay? Because it was never produced there in the first place, and which is why they could never reproduce it. And what they did was redact the Septuagint and created their own Masoretic text, and the Samaritan did the same thing, and the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, is the same thing. All of them are copies of the Septuagint, okay? Because as far as we know, the Septuagint is the original document, and everything else is a copy. There were no Hebrew Torah written in Hebrew, and if it was written in Hebrew, as the Dead Sea Scrolls are, who wrote it in Hebrew? I mean, who wrote it? I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Egyptians could write in Hebrew, just like how they could write in Greek. As a matter of fact, I would go so far to say as the Egyptian scribes, who were the best in the world, could write in fluent Hebrew and fluent Greek. Okay? As a matter of fact, they could probably write in Greek better than writing Greek better than the Greeks themselves, and they could probably write in Hebrew better than the Hebrews themselves. Because again, when we look at the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet and the Greek alphabet both come from the Egyptian alphabet. Okay, so in other words, the Egyptians created the alphabet. And from that, we get the Phoenician alphabet, we get the Greek alphabet, we get the Hebrew alphabet, all from the ancient Egyptian alphabet, right? At the end of the day. I mean, these are the facts. And so the idea, that these documents were probably written by the Egyptians is not a stretch at all. As a matter of fact, it's the most likely scenario. And again, even the Jews themselves in their pseudepigrapha state that the Torah was written, or as they claim, quote unquote, translated in Egypt. Okay, so what we are seeing here is that everything about the Hebrew history, I mean actual history, not literary history, not mythology, everything goes back to Egypt. Okay, this is where everything ends up. This is where the starting point, not just for the Hebrews, but for the Greeks and the Christians as well. Okay, their history started in Egypt, because prior to 330 BC, when the Greeks entered Egypt, and this is what we're talking about, the 3rd, 4th century era, many of the documents that we have from Greece, from Greece was actually found in Alexandria. And again, Alexandria is in Egypt, even though people try to say it's Greece. They make it seem like Alexandria was Greek, but no, it wasn't. Alexandria was actually in Egypt. Okay, for those that don't know, and a lot of these documents, these Greek documents, was written in Alexandria. And we have a classical so-called classical Greece, but there's no writings from the classical Greek era, no manuscripts from the classical Greek era. There's not many Greek manuscripts older than 200 BCE or 150 BCE or somewhere around that period. Just like with the Hebrew documents, nothing goes back further than that, around 300 BCE for the Greeks. Okay, they don't have any original document from 800 BCE or 500 BCE or anything like that. None at all. They all of the most of the Hebrew manuscripts and the Greek manuscripts come after 300 BCE, after they entered Egypt, after the Greeks entered Egypt, and after the Hebrews entered Egypt. Okay, and there's a lot of question as to whether or not the Hebrews actually, are the so-called Jews, actually entered Egypt. They could have been, based on some of the evidence that we have today, they were probably Egyptians. Okay, the first Jews, or the first mention of the Jews, which was supposedly by Hecataeus, okay, around 300 BCE, was that the Jews were Egyptians that left Egypt because of differences with the people in Egypt, or the government in Egypt at the time. That was, there was basically, they left Egypt because they were considered to be inhospitable in the practice of their religious rituals and things like that. But we could go into that another time. That's another story. But that's the first mention of Egypt first mention of Jews in Greek writing. Okay, in which was mostly done in Alexandria. And so there's also there's a lot of writing on this topic, and we can go into that, but this is not the venue for that. We're going to continue with Dr. Kip, and let's hear what else he has to say.
At some point, probably in the early 3rd, maybe the late 4th, early 3rd century BCE, that's sort of as far back as we can track this stuff, realistically. This is where it all began. And as I mentioned to an apologist that people might be familiar with on Twitter, Dr. Stephen Boyce, I was in a conversation with him on the phone once, not that long ago, talking about this issue. And as I said it to him, anything back prior to, like the early 3rd, late 4th century with regards to the text, with regards to the religion, it's a black box. We just can't get in there. There's very little actual material culture that survives from the period that provides us any meaningful insight into what was going on in Judaism at the period. So
Jonathan Adler.
This is exactly what Jonathan Adler talks about.
Yes, his book on the origins of Judaism as a religion, and obviously, this goes into your course actually a little, just to tease people what the common religion of the Jews, or if we could even use the term, because that might be anachronistic as well. Okay. Judeans, Judaios, okay, the people who are located in this region, okay, that have Jerusalem as their central focal point, which was not always the case. That's a whole nother rabbit trail within that black box that you're talking about, Kip. That we do not have material evidence prior, let's just say 3rd century. Like before that, we're not sure about synagogues. We're not sure about what, like these sacred baths where they would go and they would wash, and you name it, even kosher food. I mean, there's so many things we don't know, and we're looking at the oldest text, right?
Okay, so that's very pertinent right there. That what he just said, what Derek just said, and what Dr. Kip just said, and which goes along basically to what I'm saying. Before 300 BC, there's nothing about Judaism except the legends, or the what we have in the Old Testament up until the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. All of that, okay, Ezra and Nehemiah, the exile, the Babylonian exile, all of that is legendary. Okay, it's not history, and there's nothing to show that any of that. There's no material evidence for any of it, as Dr. Kip just said. Okay, it's so it's all in the realms of mythology. When we want to get into real history about Judaism, it all goes back to Egypt in the 3rd century BCE. And again, I'm going to make the point that goes for the same for the Greeks as well as the Christians. The only problem with the Christians is that they have, basically, you know, their doctrine, with their doctrine, they've basically hampered themselves by with their outrageous claim that some guy named Jesus Christ was born in the 1st century, and that was the start of Christianity. But actually, the start of Christianity goes all the way back to 300 BCE in Egypt, as same as Judaism and the same as the Greeks. Their origins, the Christian origins, go back that far in Egypt. So all three, whether it's the Greeks, whether it's the Jews, or whether it's the Christians, their origins are in Egypt around 300 BCE. And like I said, the only reason why the Christians can't go back that far because they hamstrung themselves with this whole idea that Jesus Christ was born in the 1st century, so that's when Christianity started, when that's not the case. Because when you look at the evidence and the different communities that they claim was around the time of the Acts in the New Testament, when Paul was supposed to be around going all over the place to these different communities, the amount of Christians that exist in, say, 50 AD doesn't comport with the fact that the religion started in the 1st century, and that 50 years, and even in the time of 300 years later, in the time of Alexander, there was so many Christians all over that area. It just doesn't make any sense that they could have started in the 1st century. But it does make sense if we start Christianity around 300 BCE in Egypt. It does make sense that there's so many different Christian communities at the time of Paul and at the time of the quote unquote so-called apostles. Okay, that would explain these different Christian communities spread all over the place. Okay, this what would explain that, and that would be very easily explained that way. But they come up with all kind of different explanations because they want to claim that there was this guy called Jesus Christ that was born, and that there was no such thing. That never happened. And there are plenty of Christians that don't believe that it happened. From that, I'm talking about Christians from back in those days. Okay, that didn't go along with that whole idea of the birth of a historical Jesus. A lot of Christians went against that in the different councils. That's what all these different councils, Council of Nicaea, the Council of Constantinople, the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Chalcedon, the Second Council of Constance, all of these different councils had dealt with that issue of Jesus' divinity or humanity, and many Christians didn't go along with it. And the ones that didn't go along with it, they lost, they were excommunicated or exiled or whatever, and so their history took root. And this is what we have. So this is the situation with the Christian. But if we were to deal with the Christian issue in its correct form, it would point out that just like the Jews and just like the Greeks, all of it started in Egypt in around 300 BCE or thereabouts. So, but let's continue
here that we have. So, I mean, this is fascinating.
Yeah. I got to say something. We're going to talk a little bit about language here at some point too, but I want to read something about this particular manuscript.
Let me pull it back up. So yeah, got it. I'm going to zoom out. I'm moving it around a little to get people to actually see zooming in.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool. This is an animal skin for those who don't know. So
yeah, it's vellum.
Vellum.
So
do we know what kind of animal this was?
Probably calf skin.
Okay.
The vast majority of the scrolls, I believe, are Jewish cows, as Craig Evans put it in that terrible interview with Sean McDowell. But yeah, there's goat skin in there as well. but it's so we determine this stuff through DNA testing. Of course, not every fragment for every Dead Sea Scrolls has been DNA tested, and I have no idea what this particular one was, but it was probably cow, possibly goat. So I want to.
Okay, that's very important. So, as Dr. Kip himself says, not all these fragments have been tested, and I pointed out earlier that the ones that are in the Israeli or the Palestinian Institute have not been tested to determine their if they're actually fake or not. But that the ones that was in private collections and some of the ones that even Dr. Kip himself tested and found to be fake, okay, they went on they underwent rigorous testing. So my question would be, when would does Dr. Kip have access to this particular piece here that he can test it to find out if it's do some rigorous testing to find out if it's real or not? I doubt it, because again, as I pointed out earlier, a lot of these documents was not made accessible to scholars for decades after they were found. They were kept in secret, and I don't know. I mean, what they could have been doing with them. Who knows what they have done to these documents while they had them in seclusion, doing God knows what with them. So but that's an interesting point there by Dr. Kip. Okay, and I would concur with that.
Read just a paragraph here from the edition published about this particular manuscript with regards to the actual text. Okay, so this is Frank Moorcross writing here. He says the relationship in 4Q Exodus Leviticus F, that's the designation for this manuscript, to the other textual families, that's the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and the Masoretic text, can be summarized as follows. In no case does 4Q Exodus Leviticus F stand with the Masoretic text alone against either the Samaritan Pentateuch or the Septuagint, or the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint together in inferior or, for that matter, superior readings. Nor does 4Q Exodus Leviticus F side with the Septuagint alone against the Samaritan Pentateuch or the Masoretic text, or the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text together in secondary readings. Its filiation to judge from significant inferior readings is with the Samaritan tradition. But at the same time, its freedom and tendency towards expansion provide an interesting insight into the early stage of Pentateuchal text in Palestine. We must conclude that 4Q Exodus Leviticus F, this manuscript, is an early, direct, or better collateral witness to the textual family, which has been called Proto-Samaritan, and which I prefer to label as Palestinian. So what he's saying here is that for the most part, this looks like a member of the so-called Samaritan Pentateuch family of texts on the basis of the readings that have survived in this manuscript. But something important that he notes is that being said, there's still lots of places within just these few fragments where there seems to be, a tendency towards readings in the Septuagint as well as towards the Masoretic text. There's places where we find agreement with all of the editions. So it's predominantly Samaritan, but it sort of goes back to a time even prior to or at the point in which these individual streams of traditions are starting to settle and become more distinct from one another, which is pretty wild, pretty interesting.
Again, I just want to make another point here. Dr. Kip is making an equivalence between the Samaritan, the Septuagint, and the Masoretic text when there is no such thing. Again, both of those documents, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Masoretic text, is more than 1,000 years after the Septuagint. as far as we know at this point. Okay, so to make an equivalency between them, as if you know, the Dead Sea Scroll would come from a period where, you know, the tradition of the Samaritan, no, the tradition of the Samaritan text and the tradition of the uh, Masoretic text is from the 10th century AD, a couple hundred years ago. Okay, not from 250 BCE. Those two texts are not equivalent to the Septuagint. The Septuagint is, as far as we know at this point, is the oldest text, and that both of those texts were copied from the Septuagint. Now, the Jews, you know, they claim that the Masoretic text was copied from the Hebrew text, but then they have to produce the Hebrew text to prove that, and they can't, and they have not done so. So until they can produce this Hebrew text, which is what they're trying to say that the Dead Sea Scroll is, until they can produce it, then we can't say that there's no way that we can say that the Samaritan, the Masoretic text came from the Hebrew scriptures. We can't say that. Okay, they have to produce that the Hebrew scriptures, the original Hebrew scriptures, and they can't produce it, and they claim they have lost it. And again, you know, why couldn't they reproduce it in back in those? Wouldn't it have been easier to reproduce uh, the Hebrew text back in around 200 BCE or 250 BCE after they lost it, than try to reproduce it in the 9th and the 10th centuries when they did? And again, what did they reproduce the Masoretic text from? What did they copy from to get the Masoretic text in the 10th century AD? This is the question. And they haven't been able to produce anything other than the Septuagint. And so until then, until they produce the actual Hebrew text, then the only thing they can go by is that they copied the Masoretic text from the Septuagint. And this, which is, you know, it's common knowledge, really. And it's the same thing with the Latin Vulgate. You know, it was copied from the Septuagint because there's no other text for it to have been copied from that we know about, that we have extant today. So, you know, that's all I would say about that. I'm going to leave that there. So let's continue with Dr. Kip.
Interesting. So, but I think it's important to, at this point, to talk about language and what language can tell us about the origins of the Bible and the origin of the biblical text. So the script that we're looking at here, the language is Hebrew. The script that we're looking at is Aramaic. The Hebrew script is what we now call Paleo Hebrew, which is an unfortunate term. It's better appropriated as simply Hebrew, or even better, just Canaanite, because it's the same script that was used by everybody in the you know, the mid to late Iron Age region of what we now call Palestine. It's the script that everybody used. It's not Hebrew. It was used by the Canaanites as well. So we have manuscripts from Qumran that are written in this Canaanite Paleo Hebrew script. The Samaritan Pentateuch was after the establishment of this Samaritan community in and around Mount Gerizim, which happened in this same period of time, somewhere in the, you know, late 4th, early 3rd century BCE. They started to collect all their written traditions, their texts, using this old Canaanite script. So this is an Aramaic script. The Aramaic script is something that the Jews developed out of Babylon, basically. The Greek, you know, the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible are written in Greek with a Greek script. So now, I mean, there's a temptation here to think that, well, the Samaritans are preserving all their texts, and bear in mind, for the Samaritans, it's just the Torah, nothing but the Torah, right? Surely they've they're just preserving the way that it was always written in this very old Canaanite script. Really? Is that the way it goes? Or is it rather that the Samaritans have adopted this text and determined that we're going to write this using the old Canaanite script because of our deference to the ancient religion, to our ideas about the antiquity, and to the, not using that impure Aramaic script, that's associated with Babylon. We're going to use like the old original script. And I think there's something important to note here is that yes, we have copies of Torah texts that came that are in the form of the Canaanite script.
Okay, we're going to pause right there for a second. All right, so what Dr. Kip just pointed out about the Samaritan Pentateuch, that they used the older Canaanite Paleo-Hebrew script to write it because in deference to the fact that, that's the language it was written in, and also that, they don't want to write it in the impure Aramaic script. Now, the same thing can be applied to the Masoretic text. This is exactly what happened with the Masoretic text. The rabbins, the rabbinic Jews, decided to rewrite the Septuagint in Hebrew, in the Hebrew script, because of the doctrinal differences in the that they have with the Septuagint. And so they're doing the same thing that Dr. Kip is saying that the Samaritans are doing. They're rewriting their Hebrew script in Hebrew. They're rewriting their script in Hebrew and saying that, this is the language it was written in originally, and so in deference to that, we're going to rewrite it in that language, and this is what we're going to do, and that's what they did. And so this is why we only have a complete copy of the Torah, and it dates back to the 9th century or the 10th century AD, not back to 250 BCE. They don't have anything that's that old. Okay, what they have, the Masoretic text goes back to the 10th century, and it was a rewritten Septuagint. Basically, they rewrote or redacted the Septuagint to produce the Masoretic text, just like they did to produce the Pentateuch or the Samaritan Pentateuch, like Dr. Kip is saying. So the same thing can be applied to the Masoretic text, but this doesn't happen because it's a lot of this stuff is is Jewish apology, and so the Jews they're perfectly capable and of exposing Christian apologetics, but they don't really expose their own apologetics. But that's another story. But let's continue.
Written in this Paleo Hebrew script, but these are a minority. By far, the vast majority of manuscripts that we have, Hebrew manuscripts, are written using this Aramaic script. Importantly, we have nothing of the Hebrew prophets written in a Canaanite script. Why is this important? So I'll answer my own question. This is a
Okay, Dr. Kip, before you answer your own question, why you don't have any of the prophets written in Canaanite or Paleo Hebrew, you're gonna, he's gonna come with a very good answer about that, and it's more than likely the case. But let's talk about this Canaanite script and this Paleo Hebrew script before we continue. What is Paleo Hebrew, and why not just call it Hebrew as opposed to Paleo Hebrew? And Canaanite. I like Dr. Kip said, why not just call it Canaanite as opposed to calling it Paleo Hebrew? Because that's what it is, Canaanite. But the problem with both Paleo Hebrew and Canaanite is that there were no Canaanites and there was no Canaan. Okay, this is the problem. So the language that they're calling Canaanite is not Canaanite. Okay. Now the question is, what was that language? If it's not, because the name Canaan is a biblical name, and that's not the people in what they call Canaan now didn't call themselves Canaanites. And the Egyptians, who are the record keepers of the ancient world, didn't call the people living in Canaan Canaanites, because Canaan was under Egyptian rule for much of its history. So what did they call it? They didn't call it Canaan, and the language. So if they didn't call it Canaan, the language that was spoken at the time was not Canaanite, and it was not Paleo Hebrew, because they didn't call themselves Hebrews either. Okay, all of this is anachronistic. Okay, so what was the language? From what I know, the language that what the people call themselves, or what the Egyptians call these people, was the Retjenu or the Rettenu, the Rejtenu or the Rejtenu, something like that. Okay, that's the Egyptian name for Canaan. So they weren't speaking Canaanite, okay, because there was no such thing as Canaan. It's a biblical name, okay, and the people don't know anything of that name before the Bible was written. The Bible was written somewhere around 300 BC, according to what we know. So prior to 300 BC, what were these people being called before they imposed this biblical, before the biblical history was imposed on us? Okay, what did they call it? And they didn't call it Canaanite. So so the language was not Canaanite. Okay, and which brings me to another point. Canaanite is described, and to actually prove my point here, I'm going to prove the point I'm making. I'm going to give receipts here. The point that this Canaanite misconception, or whatever you want to call it, okay, it's described as a Semitic language, one of the coming from the Semitic language group. Okay, so we're talking 250 BCE, going all the way back to Israel in the time of David, any time from the 1200 BC forward, when Israel was supposedly started and developed and had its kingdom and all of this. And so supposedly the language that was spoken was a Semitic language, from a Semitic language, and there's a whole bunch of languages described as belonging to the Semitic language group, including Ethiopic and a lot of African languages, right, are described as being Semitic. But what is this Semitic? Was there such a thing as a Semitic language? Are you a Semitic peoples? Let's take a look at it. Okay. From what I have discovered about this, let's look at this. It says here about the Semitic people. Okay. It says, and this is Wikipedia I'm looking at, and so let's just, it's not the, it's not the best, probably not the only place we can find information about Semites, but let's look at what they say here. It's the quickest and easiest thing since we're doing this video. It says here that the Semitic peoples, or Semitic cultures, is an absolute term for an ethnic, cultural, or racial group. The terminology is now largely unused outside the grouping Semitic languages. Okay. First used in the 1770s by members of the Göttingen School of History, this is the biblical terminology for a race. This biblical terminology for race was derived from Shem, Hebrew, one of the three sons of Noah in the book of Genesis, together with the parallel terms Hamites and Japhetites. In archaeology, the term is sometimes used informally as a kind of shorthand for ancient Semitic speaking peoples. Then it goes ethnicity and race. It says here, further information: Afro-Asiatic, herein, Proto-Semitic languages, Hamitic, genetic history of the Middle East, Arabic race, Caucasian race, Hamites, and scientific racism. And then they go on to explain. The term Semitic, in a racial sense, was coined by members of the Göttingen School of History in the early 1770s. Other members of the Göttingen School of History coined a separate term, Caucasian, in the 1780s. These terms were used and developed by numerous other scholars over the next century. In the early 20th century, the racialist classification of Carl Milton S. Kuhn included the Semitic peoples in the Caucasian race as similar in appearance to the Indo-European. Okay, that's as far as we need to go. If people want to find out more about this, they can go ahead and look at it themselves. But as far as we know here, the term Semitic, which is supposedly Canaanite, one of the Canaanite language is a Semitic language, that term was first used in the 1770s, and it's a racial classification by Europeans, basically. Europeans use that term. They invented the term, in the 1770s, right? But now, this term was invented in the 1770s, Semitic, but we hear about Semitic languages. And let's click on that term, Semitic languages, for a second and see what we come up with. They're talking about ancient Semitic speaking peoples. And it says here, ancient Semitic speaking peoples are Proto-Semitic, like Proto-Hebrew. I mean, they have all these names. It says here, ancient Semitic speaking peoples are Proto-Semitic peoples, were people who lived throughout the ancient Near East, including the Levant, Mesopotamia, the Arabian Peninsula, the Horn of Africa, from the 3rd millennium BC until the end of antiquity. So, a name that was invented in the 17th century in Europe is being applied to all of these people in Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Near East. How does that work? So basically, what we are finding out is there were no such thing as a Semitic languages. Okay, so because my question would be, before 1770, when this term was invented, and they started calling these languages Semitic, what were these languages called prior to that? Okay, what were these languages prior to being called Semitic in the 17th century by Europeans? So what we see is that these Europeans have taken this term Semitic that they created in the 1770s and applied it to languages in Africa, in Arabia, Peninsula, and all over the Near East. How do you do something like that? And then now they're claiming that all of these languages are Semitic, and that it comes from the Semitic speaking peoples and from the Hebrews or the Jews. So they're basically acculturated or appropriated the languages of the Africans and the Arabians and these different areas in the Near East and appropriated to themselves as being Semitic. How does that work? I mean, how do you do something like that? So at the end of the day, I'm not interested in knowing. I'm not really interested in that. I want to know what the languages were called before they were termed Semitic in the 17th century, because that's when they were termed Semitic, according to what we are reading. They started calling these languages Semitic in the 17th century. Prior to that, they weren't called Semitic. So what were they called? That was my question. But let's continue.
This is important. Were you going, oh God, what's the answer?
No. I just find it's funny how you, yeah.
So if the Hebrew prophets were writing in Iron Age Palestine, in the Cisjordan, whatever it is, they would have been writing in the conventional Canaanite script of the day. If that is the case, then why?
Okay, again, Dr. Kip is making a good point here. They would have been writing in the script of the day, but that script of the day would not have been Canaanite because there were no Canaanites. Okay, so we need to know what that script was. And Dr. Kip, I would like to ask him the question of what that script was, because as we can see, that script was not Canaanite and it was not Semitic. Okay, so let's continue.
Why no copies of the prophets in a Canaanite script? Why is everything written in this Aramaic script, which is something that the Jews, or for lack of a better term, the Jews didn't really even start to use until after the Babylonian exile? I think this whole discussion of languages and script is pretty significant and important when it comes to talking about where the Bible came from, how old it actually is, and you know, yeah.
Okay, I 100% agree with Dr. Kip at this point there with that statement. It's very important. We need to find out what these languages were that the Bible was written in. As far as we know, the Bible was written in Greek, the Septuagint. And as Dr. Kip says, why don't we have any writings in the language of the time that was in the area that they call in Canaanite? He's saying, why it's not in Canaanite language. It doesn't matter whether we call it Canaanite or not, but the point is that we don't have the documents in that language, and we only have documents in later languages. Okay, so that's again, it's more anachronism. That those documents weren't produced at the time that they claim they were produced, and this is clear by what Dr. Kip is saying. And so we don't actually know when they were produced. Okay, and they couldn't, and a lot of these documents could have easily, well, we know that they were rewritten or redacted in Hebrew and then cast backwards. So this is what's going on. So this is a fascinating video by Dr. Kip. It's very, again, I'm going to recommend that people go and watch this video and go to Dr. Kip's channel on YouTube and watch the rest of the videos about the Dead Sea Scrolls. All of it is fascinating and, very important. And I'm definitely going to keep watching it, and I'm going to keep commenting as well. I'm going to leave this comment here because, this video is getting to be very long now. We already passed 40 minutes or so. So, we're going to leave it here, and this is part 1. I'm going to continue with the same video, and we're going to develop it more as we go along. So this is part 1, and I will continue with maybe part 2, part 3, or part 4, whatever, because this is going to take a lot of work, and we're going to need to really go into it extensively. So with that said, people, I appreciate you watching this video if you did watch it, and thanks to Dr. Kip and to Derek Mythvision, for producing this video so that I can make my comments on it. And I hope they're not going to be upset or anything like that, because it's all in the spirit of scholarship, as they say. So we'll leave it at that. But again, great work by Dr. Kip. Same for Derek. Keep up the good work, guys. You're doing some important work out there. I definitely appreciate it, and I'll keep watching and I'll keep commenting. And with that said, we'll chop it up next time. I'm out.
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.